Whenever you think about some of EPCOT's older attractions, one word that probably doesn't come to mind is exciting. Unless maybe you're really into history-based dark rides, in which case, hey, you're in luck. But even amongst the park's original lineup of slow-moving omnimovers and films to stand around and watch, there still was one certain holy grail when it came to boring attractions at EPCOT, that being a boat ride over in the Land Pavilion, where guests could experience the pure thrill of watching plants grow. I know, try and hold on to your seats, guys. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Keep EPCOT Weird, a video series focusing on the stranger and more obscure aspects of EPCOT. And this episode is going to be about one of the park's most quaint attractions, Listen to the Land, a ride that, despite opening with the rest of the park back in 1982, is still around today, giving its riders a nice little tour of the Land Pavilion's backstage greenhouses, with some additional dark ride elements thrown in as well. Nowadays, it's pretty much the essential early EPCOT experience, mainly for just how untouched it is compared to everything else from that same era. So, I really want to explore both the old and newer versions of the ride with this video, and also see if we can't pick up on some of that classic old EPCOT weirdness while we're at it. After all, this is another one of those educational attractions, so you never know what can happen. But before all that, I think we ought to get some history first. Like many of Future World's other projects, the concept for what would eventually become the Land Pavilion didn't really pick up steam until the late 1970s, back when Disney started looking for companies specifically to sponsor the park's attractions. And one such company they found early on was Kraft Foods, who in 1976 agreed to help fund a pavilion about the environment. Over the next few years, Imagineers worked out the details on its design, and also created one of its main attractions, a boat ride about the planet, where riders would experience different ecosystems in a dark ride setting, complete with audio animatronics and various different effects. But eventually, that same idea was later expanded upon, when Kraft suggested that they find a way to make the attraction more so about their brand, leading Disney to come up with the ride's new second half, where you then float through a series of working greenhouses to see how the plants that they had in there were typically grown and harvested. Now, this wouldn't be the first time that Kraft's involvement in an attraction led to something of a strange experience for the sake of a better brand tie-in. It's not even the only instance of that in the same pavilion. But in the boat ride's case, the decision to include greenhouses did help make the attraction more unique, while also letting it retain the original environmental theme, now giving them a chance to explore how those two topics related to each other, something we'll be coming back to in a minute. Eventually though, construction began on the pavilion in early 1981. Between the main building itself, the three different attractions it housed, and the series of greenhouses it had backstage, now also including an aqua cell for raising fish, the Land Pavilion ended up covering about 6 acres of the park when it was finally finished, making it the largest Future World exhibit they had back then. And as such, the land was actually featured pretty prominently in EPCOT's opening day special, where it even managed to get its own acoustic musical number, with Roy Clark singing a version of This Land Is Your Land.
As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway.
You know, at this point, if there's one thing I learned doing these videos, it's that whenever someone starts singing, you just gotta go with it.
This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island.
Something else that's pretty odd is that the whole pavilion actually kind of carried over this strange musical theme in a weird way. Obviously, you got stuff like Kitchen Cabaret, where it's literally a show about food doing a musical review, but even Listen to the Land had its own musical elements to it for some reason. For example, right after boarding the boats in the original version, the ride's first scene starts off with the Symphony of Seeds, which was this kind of abstract representation of plant growth, where you'd see light traveling through these gigantic roots to symbolize the seeding and growing process. And in the background, You also would have heard the first instance of the attraction's theme song, Listen to the Land.
You'll grow to see the sunshine on your day of birth. Let's listen to the land we all love. Nature's plan will shine above. Listen to the land, listen to the land.
Now, if a beautiful song like that doesn't just make you want to plant a sunflower, then I don't know what will.
As we head past that, however, the next scene begins to showcase some of that original ride concept that I mentioned earlier, where we see the first one of its simulated biomes, the rainforest. Again, this scene, along with the next few ones, were all carried over from before the ride became Listen to the Land, back when it was meant to be purely about the environment. But as the attraction changed throughout the late 80s, Imagineers tweaked those pre-existing scenes with some new narration to make them fit better here. So before, where the main focus probably would have been on that ecosystem specifically, they were now instead talking about its resident plant life, and how that affects its surrounding environment. A pretty clever way of refitting those older scenes to now match the ride's new theming. From there, we jump around from the desert, learning about how certain species have adapted to living in such harsh conditions, all the way to the American prairie, to hear how the landscape there was affected by stuff like storms and wildfire, also while showing us some of the area's own wildlife, with animatronic buffalo and prairie dogs, which were apparently meant to be used in the cancelled Western River Expedition attraction over at the Magic Kingdom, but eventually made their way over to EPCOT after that project was scrapped in the late 1970s. Anyway, transitioning from the prairie, we end up passing by a turn-of-the-century farmhouse, featuring a quaint little depiction of life in the early agricultural Midwest. Afterwards, we then find ourselves in a barn, and see hundreds of years worth of farming history through video and narration, explaining how different techniques and methods of growing have been developed over that time, but also noting that innovation is still taking place today, as we continue to better learn how to harvest our crops, a process that is actually happening right outside, which leads us into the next major portion of the ride, the greenhouses. With a total of 5 different ones, each of the following greenhouses all have their own unique purpose, and the first one we enter is the Tropics House. As the name would imply, this is where they grow crops from some of your more tropical regions, like pineapple, bananas, papaya, along with some more exotic stuff too. But one of the more noteworthy things about this house is how differently it's shaped compared to the other ones, where instead of being rectangular, it's actually circular, and covered with a glass geodesic dome, not unlike some of those old Robert Fuller designs that Spaceship Earth was also based on. In all likelihood though, the use of a glass dome in this house was probably to help simulate the plant's tropical habitats better, or maybe just to give that first greenhouse you see a grander appearance, before heading into some of the more normal looking ones later. But before those, we first go through the Aquacell, where they do their fish farming, because of course, in a ride all about agriculture, you'd be remiss not to mention aquaculture as well, which is what this section is dedicated to, where you can see them raising stuff like tilapia, bass, and sturgeon, all to be eaten later. Even within the context of the rest of the ride, this part is really unique. Not only does it showcase a very specific type of farming that you probably haven't ever seen before, because I know I didn't, but it also introduced some innovation to that process as well, by implementing a very distinct red lighting to the tunnel, which actually helps to stop the growth of algae in the tanks, and keeps them cleaner because of it. And over the years, they've actually had all types of weird stuff pop up in these tanks, like pacu, which are a South American freshwater fish related to piranhas, as well as shrimp and even alligators at one point. So you never really knew what you were going to see going through there. After that, we then pass through the temperate greenhouse to see how plants are grown in some of the more dry regions of the world, where they've got stuff like cotton, sunflowers, and pumpkins, all of which do particularly well in those kinds of climates. But up next is where things start to get really interesting, as we move into the production house. This is where the majority of all their staple foods are grown and harvested, with stuff like lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, all the more usual crops. Because this little section is actually where they produce a pretty large amount of the food served around Walt Disney World, and most of it right upstairs at the Land Pavilion's very own restaurant, which is a really cool aspect of the ride, and one of the main reasons I think it's so special, since there really aren't many other rides, even at EPCOT, that can offer that kind of behind-the-scenes look and also keep the whole thing so informative. For instance, I had no idea they could actually grow so much food in such a small area, but, as they point out, even a single tomato plant in here can produce over 30,000 tomatoes every 16 months, and they actually harvest more than 30 tons of produce from the gardens every single year, which I found pretty surprising. But the unusual growing doesn't end there, as it continues into the ride's final part, with the creative greenhouse, where they're showcasing some of their more innovative and unique practices, like growing plants without any soil, for example, through a practice where the roots actually hang down and move along a conveyance system to get sprayed with the nutrients that they need. Again, like the other vertical growing methods, this one was developed to help save space, and, in turn, increase crop yields. In fact, most of these weird little techniques and innovations you see throughout the greenhouses were actually brought over to the ride by people like Dr. Carl Hodges, a horticultural specialist that Disney consulted with during development on the pavilion. He, along with other academics and scientists, not him by the way, that's Danny Kaye, brought a level of expertise to the attraction, which, in this case, resulted in seeing real-world futurism when it came to agriculture, and an opportunity for them to put some of these ideas into practice, just on a smaller scale. Not always literally though. But it wouldn't be 1980s futurism without a little bit of space involved too, as this section also showcased some of the techniques they were developing for agriculture in outer space, with stuff like a spinning drum that you could put plants in to imitate gravity, or some simulated soil samples based on the surfaces of the Moon and Mars, both of which were created by NASA and being studied for future use. Ah yes, the days when people still cared about space. Good times. After that though, the ride then takes you into a tunnel, where you can see a small lab off to your right, where they were usually doing some form of tissue farming on the plants that we just saw growing. Again, yet another aspect of the research that was being done with these greenhouses. And finally, the ride wrapped up with a very quick little reprise of the Symphony of Seeds that we had at the beginning, where you could also hear another instance of the Listen to the Land theme song before disembarking the boats. All in all, this ride was extremely unique for its time, and just showed how well early EPCOT could execute these really fascinating ways of teaching people about new topics. I mean, I don't think I would have ever even thought twice about agriculture without this attraction. But it really found a way to keep the subject at hand interesting, without falling victim to those same weird results that usually came from these old educational attractions, which is a minor miracle in and of itself. As you might expect, the ride then remained largely untouched over the next 10 years, but did eventually undergo a pretty big set of changes in the early 90s, after Kraft Foods pulled funding in 1993, leading Nestle to take over that same year, and subsequently update the entire building. But luckily, unlike some of the pavilion's other attractions, Listen to the Land didn't see any real drastic changes at the time, although the few changes they did make were still pretty noticeable. The first noticeable big change actually came with the ride's name, now switching from the original Listen to the Land into the new Living with the Land, which should make a bit more sense here in a minute. And this also brought the second change with it as well, resulting in the removal of its theme song that was based on that old name, now replacing it with an entirely new soundtrack, made specifically for this version of the ride. In fact, the whole Symphony of Seeds part at the beginning, where you would have first heard that original song, was changed as well, going from those old gigantic light-up roots to now just being a forest in the middle of a thunderstorm.
Our journey begins as dramatic and sudden changes are sweeping over the land. The approaching storm may seem violent and destructive to us, but to nature, it's a new beginning in the cycle of life.
And this was really just part of a larger change when it came to the ride's new theme, where the focus was now more distinctly on the environment and our relationship with it, hence the name, Living with the Land, which is actually kind of funny, considering that same idea was what they were trying to avoid with the original version. But now it seems like they're kinda embracing the original point of these first scenes, and bringing back that old environmental theme to the ride. From there, the next couple of scenes are largely the same as they were before, only now with the key difference being that this part is narrated automatically, rather than by a live cast member like before. They were still on board the boats at this point, but didn't actually start talking themselves until you reach the greenhouses, where they then point out all of the different plants you pass by like before. But throughout the greenhouses and the rest of the ride, not much else was changed, aside from some of the plants, which were periodically switched out with new ones, depending on what they needed to grow or just what they wanted to showcase. Really, the only big permanent change in this part was with the old lab you saw at the end of the ride, which was now moved a little bit further back into the creative greenhouse instead of the exit tunnel, and was made to be a lot bigger than the original was, probably for practical reasons I'd assume, because people did actually use it. And speaking of the exit tunnel, that was also where you could see the final change too, where they also got rid of that Symphony of Seeds reprise and added a new scene, where you could now see people from all over the world standing in front of various agriculture. Quick, everybody, pick your favorite. I gotta admit, I am partial to the peas lady myself, but to each your own. For the most part, this is the version of the ride that most people note today, because believe it or not, things really haven't changed much since this one was rolled out back in the 90s, aside from some very small stuff here and there, like Disney adding Fast Pass in 2004, eventually fully removing the onboard narrators in 2006, and later picking up Chiquita as a sponsor in 2011, all of which resulting in the attraction that we have now. Every so often, they'll do something small like tweak the narration or change out the footage used in the barn scene, but never anything too drastic. That was until 2019, when they began giving the attraction its own seasonal overlay for the holidays, where the whole ride gets decked out in hundreds of colorful lights, which I really love to see. Just something to keep the experience fresh once a year, and give its fans something new, even if it is only temporary. Now, people have been speculating about a more permanent update coming to the ride, especially considering how much everything else in the park has been bombarded with changes over the years. There have always been various rumors floating around of random IP integrations, but I think it's safe for now, because the ride actually did get an integration that you never even noticed, and it was with the park's very own Food and Wine Festival, where they've now got all these little signs throughout the greenhouses promoting some of the different foods you could get around the park, now using the ride as an opportunity to showcase their ingredients. A very unexpected move, but really not all that surprising. So it's probably safe to assume that Living with the Land will kind of become the unofficial food and wine ride over the next few years, which I will say I really don't mind all that much, because it is still a very tasteful compromise, no pun intended, that keeps the original quality of the ride while also letting them promote something. And I can definitely see this being a very fruitful little partnership over the next few years. Pun intended that time. So here's to hoping that Living with the Land can continue to stay open for another 40 years, offering its own taste of the nostalgic weirdness that old Epcot was so well known for, through tandem boats and Christmas-themed tomatoes. Because with this ride, and only with this ride, can we truly be keeping Epcot weird. Hey everybody, it's Jack. Hope you enjoyed the video, but before I go, I wanted to mention that we've also got some new Keep Epcot Weird social media accounts that we're trying out, where I'll be posting some of the miscellaneous smaller topics that will probably never make their way into a full video, but are still pretty interesting. As of now, we've got both a Twitter and an Instagram that'll be posting the same stuff, so feel free to just pick your favorite one. But I'm also going to try and put some on the community tab of this channel as well, just for those of you who really don't use anything else. So be sure to go and follow those, or just keep your notifications on. Aside from that though, we're just about all finished with this episode. But not before we get Roy Clark back out here to sing us off. Let's kick it, Roy!
A voice was chanting, this land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Street waters. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me. This is some kind of place, isn't it, Roy?
Wow, Danny. You know, raised in the country on the farm, I thought I'd do a little bit of something about growing things.
Yeah.
But this beats all. You know, they even raise fish in here.
Fish?
I wouldn't lie to you. Let's go fish story.